Valentina Valenti stared at her son's final report card. George had just graduated high school with marks that filled her with disappointment. George had always been lazy when it came to schoolwork. He received C's throughout his academic career despite being sent to the best private schools that money could get him into. Valentina frequently scolded her underachieving son and tried to punish him. However, all of her efforts to get him to work harder always resulted in failure. Given his grades, George could only get into a community college. When Valentina brought the idea of going to a community college, George rejected the idea. Instead, he told her that he wanted to join the family business that she ran. Valentina put her head down when she heard her son's words. She had inherited the business from her father after his death and the untimely death of her brother. The business was going strong, but she had not started with it. She went to college after high school and began working in a different industry before she began working for the family business after her father began to slow down. George had always intended to follow his mother into the family business. That was the main reason he saw no need to put any effort into his schoolwork. George figured that his future was set. Valentina walked away from her son and retreated to her bedroom. Over the following days, she thought a great deal about her son's choices. She did not want to reward him for taking the easy way out. She wanted him to understand that he would have to overcome adversity at some point and that someone was not always going to be around to bail him out. Valentina had always tried to set a good example for her son. She figured that she had to because she did not want George to turn out like his father. George's father, Marshall Shrimpton, was the ne'er-do-well son of a local dynasty. The Shrimpton family's wealth stretched back over 200 years. Marshall was never trusted with any of the family's holdings, however, as the family knew his shortcoming too well. Marshall was, instead, pushed into politics, serving in several governors' administrations because he was simply not trustworthy enough to be given any responsibility for the family companies. His family's opinion of him was only further confirmed when he impregnated Valentina before marriage. Marshall's family disapproved of the relationship between the two of them. Some disapproved of Valentina because of her last name alone, while others in his family simply did not like the fact that her family's wealth was lower than Marshall's and that Valentina was more independently successful than Marshall could ever be. Still, they pressured Marshall to marry Valentina for appearances. Valentina was happy to marry him at the time, as Marshall was charming and possessed more talents than his family gave him credit for. However, not long after they married, Valentina realized that Marshall was simply unwilling to do the work required to make use of his skills. After George's second birthday, Valentina and Marshall divorced. George's relationship with Marshall was distant after that. Marshall was frequently away on trips and rarely saw his son until his death a few years later in a plane crash. Valentina saw a lot of Marshall in her son. George had his father's sense of entitlement and slothful work ethic. These traits seemed as inherited to Valentina as George's slight build and delicate features. Valentina wanted to make sure that her son turned out to be nothing like his father. Valentina decided to give her son an ultimatum that she knew could only end one of two ways. Either George would go along with her plans or he would run away from home. The latter seemed unthinkable to her given the fact that she had coddled him so much that she was sure he could not live on his own for long. George came home after hanging out with a group of his friends and found his mother waiting for him in the kitchen. Valentina smiled at her son and said, "How was your day, George?" "Good, Mom." "Yours?" George replied as he took hold of a glass from the cupboard. "I've thinking about your request to come to work for me," Valentina said. George looked at Valentina strangely. He did not consider his earlier statement to be a request. He assumed it was something that would happen. "Are you sure you want to do it?" Valentina asked. "Of course, Mom." "Well, you know you have to start from the bottom and work your way up." "Why?" "I can't give you special treatment. It wouldn't be fair to those." "Life isn't fair, Mom." I've got dumb kids in my school going to Ivy League schools because that's where everyone in their family goes. That's life. You take care of your own and the hell with everyone else. I've taken care of you, George. I think you can admit that. You've taken good care of me, George said as he poured himself a glass of soda. Perhaps I've protected you too much. What are you talking about? You don't seem to think you have to work for anything. You got your job from Grandpa. What did you ever do? Valentina cut off her son and glared at him as she replied, I got into a good school without any legacy points. I was the youngest executive ever at the company I started with out of college. My father wouldn't even give me a job out of college. I had to earn one. You think you can just walk into his company and start as a higher-up with no skills or knowledge? My friend Henry's father is bringing him on. He's teaching him what he needs to know. Henry? Well, at least I know I won't have to be worrying about that company as a rival in the future. Oh, come on, Mom. No one can expect you to treat your kid like you would anybody else. Maybe not, but I will. George glared at his mother and asked, Okay, for the sake of argument, what's your starting position? Our entry position for a non-college graduate is a junior secretary, although some of the girls call her the office girl or the junior receptionist. George stared at his mother in silence before he said, You're joking. No, that's where you'll have to start if you don't want to go to college. A fucking secretary. Don't use that kind of language with me, Valentina admonished her son. You're kidding me? No. You can't expect me to be running around for your employees. What would they think of your son doing that? They wouldn't know that, except for the ones that know you. So you're going to hide the fact that I'm your son. Well, I don't employ guys for those kinds of jobs, so yes, I'm going to hide the fact that you're anyone's son. George froze as he heard his mother's words. After a few seconds of silence, he asked, You seriously think I'm going to come to work for you as a girl? Well, no. You're not really a girl. You'll just be a guy who happens to look and act like a girl. You've lost your mind, George replied as he threw up his hands. It's that or nothing. Well, then it's nothing. Then what are you going to do? Whatever. That's not a plan. I'll figure something out. You'd better. In fact, given the speed you generally move at, I better give you a deadline. You've got 3 weeks. You don't want to go school, fine. Well, then you need to find a job. You've got 3 weeks to find one. If you don't have one, then you either move out or come to work for me where a person with your education and skill starts. This is a fucking joke, right? No, and don't take that tone with me. Fine. I'll go get a job. I don't care what I have to do, but I'm not doing that. You need me, Mom. I'm the only family you got. You need someone to turn the business over to. I'm sure I can find plenty of capable people to run my business when I'm gone. I love you, George, but you need me more than I need you. You just have to trust me that this is for the best. George threw up his hands and walked out of the room. George woke up and saw the alarm clock showing the time, 9:38 a.m. He clenched his eyes before he pushed himself out of bed. He grabbed hold of his head and tried not to think about what the day would bring. It was 3 weeks to the day from the day his mother gave him the ultimatum. All hopes that she would forget it were dashed as she made sure to give him daily reminders of it. George could only hope that her threat was hollow. George got to his feet and walked out of his bedroom in his wrinkled pajama flannel bottoms and white t-shirt. He walked down the steps and into the kitchen where he saw his mother reading the newspaper with a cup of tea. So how did the job search go this week? Valentina asked her son. George put his head down and said, Same as last week. Valentina took a sip of her tea and asked, You remember what I told you? Yes, George said as he buried his chin into his chest. So what's it going to be? Oh, come on, Mom. You can't expect me to do this. I'm not going to do you any special favors. I've given you every opportunity in life and each time, you've wasted it. There are no more golden opportunities coming from me. Can't I at least work as a man? No. I don't want any of my girls weirded out by some male secretary invading their comfort zones. Girls are different with each other than they are with men, well, at least with straight men. Mom, there are plenty of male, not secretaries, what do they call them now? Administrative assistants, which is just a nice way of saying secretary when you're talking about a man doing the job. So, there are guys doing it? Why can't I? Yes, but the men are largely, if not exclusively, gay. I have some homophobic older employees that might not take well to a gay secretary. Why Amanda's secretary, Evelyn, she's almost 72, and she hates gays. I'm not gay. I know, sweetie, your grades and appearance clearly show that, but you'd have to at least act the part to really integrate yourself with the other members of my office's support staff. This is ridiculous. My house, my company, my rules. If you don't like it, there's the door, Valentina said, pointing to the front door of the home. Valentina smiled at her son. She had George right where she wanted him and was going to keep pressing her advantage. She had not guided her family's company to the top of a male-dominated industry by sitting back and being placid. Valentina knew full well that when she had an opportunity, she had to seize it. George's sulking face told her all she needed to know. Valentina had watched her son underachieve his whole life. He never took his schoolwork seriously and hung around with a group of friends that she considered delinquents and scum. Several of George's male friends had been arrested for vandalism and drug possession, and 2 of his female friends had been as well. She hated their lack of manners and the baggy clothing of the boys, as well as the slutty short plaid schoolgirl skirts with ripped stockings and goth-like combat boots his female friends tended to wear. Valentina felt her son's friends were a collection of freaks and deviants who were a bad influence on him. By the defeated look in her son's eyes, Valentina knew that she was about to get the wedge she needed to separate George from his friends. George glanced up at his mother and said in a low voice, "I'll do it." Valentina smirked as she looked at her son while he stared down at the floor, unable to meet her gaze. "Do what, dear?" George sighed and said, "I'll work for you. I'm glad you finally came around." "What do I have to do?" George asked as he nervously tugged on his shirt. "Well, you have to start getting ready for your new job. You're going to start next Monday, but we have much to do to get you ready." "Like what?" George asked. "Well, we have to give you makeover and get you some new clothes for work and around the house." "Around the house?" George shrieked. "Yes, you can't keep walking around here like that. You need to get into Gia's mind and become her." "Gia?" "Yes, that's your name." "I don't get to pick my name?" "You didn't pick your name the last time around either, so don't feel too bad about it. Gia's the name I always saved for my daughter, but I never had one." "Don't you think that name will be confusing? Can't it be Georgia or Georgina or something that's not that different from my name?" "No, we need to reinforce that there's a clear distinction from George and the girl you're going to be. I think Gia helps create the separation you're going to need from your old life." "Old life? I don't want to." "George, dear, you have to become the girl you're going to be in body and mind. You have to be her. It's like method acting. You need to live the part. You can't go home and be yourself, you have to stay in the right frame of mind. We can't afford any slip-ups at work. I don't want anybody thinking that you're some tranny or a sissy boy. I want them to look at you and say that Gia is just like any other girl." George froze up as he heard his mother's words and realized what he had agreed to. As much as he wanted to run, he knew he had no better opportunities outside the front door of his mother's home. As a slight man, standing only 5 feet 7 inches and 140 pounds, George did not have much strength to compete with the other people living on the streets. He also knew he had been too coddled in life to make it on his own. George felt like crying as he realized that he was trapped. He knew that his mother could do whatever she wanted with him, and he would have little ability to refuse to go along with it. Valentina looked over her stunned son and said, "Well, let's get started then." "Now?" George asked, breaking his stupor. "No time like the present, dear." George nodded and said, "What do you want me to do?" "Well, first go upstairs and get into the shower and get rid of all that nasty boy hair beneath your head. When you're done, shave your beard. You look so much better when you don't have that George Michael stubble." "Who's George Michael?" "He's the singer you were named after. I had a thing for him in the 80s before I realized that he was so. Dad told me I was named after his father." "Oh, that's what I told him so he would go along with the name. Now, go get rid of all that ugly hair." "Mom, I don't think it'll make a difference. No one is going to believe that I'm a girl. You've got to have faith. Don't quote Limp Bizkit songs, they suck." "Wow, see that, son?" "What?" "You've only agreed to become Gia 5 minutes ago, and we've already found something we can agree on for the first time in 5 years." George smiled for a moment before he plodded up the stairs. He walked into the bathroom and disrobed. He stepped into the shower and washed his body before he picked up his mother's razor and shaving foam. George lathered his legs up and began to remove his body hair. Each time George placed the blades on his skin, he felt more and more emasculated about what he was doing. George cursed himself for putting himself in the position he was in. He wanted to scream out how wrong he felt at that moment, but he knew it would not do him any good. George finished with his legs and removed the hair from his chest and forearms next before moving on to his armpits. Once George was done shaving his body, he shut off the water. He grabbed a towel and smelt the strawberry scent of the shaving foam on his newly smooth body. He groaned at the feminineness of his scent as he dried himself off before he began to shave his face. George shaved off all of his facial hair before he redressed in his pajamas and went to find his mother. Valentina smiled as she saw her son's hairless forearms as he walked towards her. "Well, you look better already. You even smell better," Valentina said with a smile. George rolled his eyes and said, "Let's get the rest of this hell over with." "As you wish, dear. Come along." George followed Valentina up to the master bathroom and saw the strips laid out on her sink top. George knew what they were for and cringed at the thought of having his eyebrows waxed. Valentina told him to take a seat on the toilet as she prepared the wax for him. She put the wax and strands over his eyes and pulled them away. George let out a yelp that prompted Valentina to smirk before she said, "We're almost done. I just have to tweeze out the little leftovers." George prepared for more pain, but he found the tweezing to be near painless. Valentina finished and told George to get dressed in the clothing she had left for him on her bed. George hesitantly walked over to the clothing. George picked up the new pair of black panties and saw the matching bra, one of his mother's around-the-house t-shirts, a pair of her sweatpants and his Adidas sandals. George looked at the collection of clothing on his mother's bed as Valentina came out of the bathroom. She glared at George and said, "Go get changed." "What are you waiting for?" "This isn't what I expected," George said. "Good, because you'll only be wearing those once, well, maybe twice. Those clothes go with the backstory I came up with for you for the girls at the shop. I told my stylist, Dominique, to tell everyone you're my tomboy niece who's come to work for me." "Does Dominique know how I really am?" "Of course, but she's a born liar so she can keep a secret about who you really are." George nodded and carried the clothing into his mother's bathroom. He disrobed and put each article of clothing on and came out for his mother to inspect him. Valentina smirked as she looked him over before she grabbed 2 pairs of socks and stuffed 1 pair into each of his bra cups. Valentina nodded as she took a step away from to take in his appearance. She then smiled and said, "That will do just fine." George put his head down before his mother said, "Now, let's just put the finishing touches on you and we'll be ready to go." George nodded as Valentina took his hand and brought him back into her bathroom. Valentina sat George down again on the toilet bowl and began applying eyeliner, lipstick and mascara to his face. George felt like a fool as his mother gave him a makeover, but he felt as if he had no other options. Valentina then brushed his hair into the feminine hairstyle she could come the closest to giving him. She smiled at the almost pageboy haircut her son had, and she imagined how good he would look when his hair had some semblance of order to it. Valentina took a step away from George and said, "I think it needs one more thing." "What?" George asked as his mother rushed out of the bathroom. Valentina came back in carrying a silver necklace and placed it around George's neck. George stood up to take a look at himself in the mirror and cringed at the girlish reflection staring back at him. The padding had changed his boyish frame into a girlish one, while the makeup gave him a feminine appearance. As George stared vacantly at himself, Valentina slapped her head and said, "Oh, I don't want to forget the earrings. I know how much you used to love wearing them. I always hated how you wore so many in both ears during that silly punk phase, but now, I'm glad I've got all those holes to work with. At least, now, you won't look so silly wearing earrings. They'll just help you look pretty." George sighed as his mother put silver hoop earrings into both of his ears. The small adjustment to his appearance served to amplify the feminineness of his appearance. While the makeup had eliminated the ambiguousness of his perceived sexuality, the earrings made him look almost like one of the girly girls he frequently made fun of at school. Valentina hugged her son and said, "I told you had to have a little faith in your appearance. Look at you. You look more like a girl than some of those girls on your school's basketball team, and practically none of them get questioned about if they're really girls." George nodded in silence before Valentina tugged on his shoulder and said, "We really have to get going. We don't want to be late." George walked behind her in silence. He climbed into the passenger seat and sat in silence as his mind raced about what was going on around him. He felt as if he was powerless to stop anything, even then he knew he could at any moment. George felt sick to his stomach that he was too scared of the consequences to try to survive on his own. Valentina pulled the car up in front of a strip mall and said, "Come on. Don't just sit there, we're a little late already." George got out of the car and stared into the salon where he saw a number of women getting their hair done. Valentina opened the door and Dominique walked towards the door to greet them. After saying hello to Dominique, Valentina said, "Let me introduce the two of you. Gia, this is my stylist, Dominique. Dominique, this is my niece Gia." The stylist smiled as she shook George's hand before she said, "Oh, it's good to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you. I'm glad that your aunt finally got you in here. Well, my girl's got to shed her tomboyish look if she wants to work for me. I only employ girly girls in my support staff. I like to give our clients something nice to look at. Don't worry, Valentina. When I'm done with her, she'll be the girliest girl in your office." Valentina smirked at her blushing son before she put her left arm around him and hugged him. She whispered in his ear, "Remember, in here you're a lady, and you have to act like one. You don't want to be out yourself as a guy in here because a lot of these women have children your age, and you know how quickly word spreads around town about this sort of thing." George nodded and walked towards Valentina as he thought about how the news of another kid's accidental outing of himself as a homosexual spread through the town like wildfire the year before. George was well aware that given his feminized appearance, the rumors regarding him would be even more salacious. Dominique patted the seat at her station and told George to take a seat. George sat down, watched her pick up her scissors. She smiled at George and whispered in his ear, "Don't worry, I'm not going to make you look like Britney Spears or something like that. Your hair isn't long enough. I'm just going to take this mop of hair and give you a cute pixie cut." "Great," George replied, feigning enthusiasm. Dominique smiled as she began cutting his hair. George listened to the other clients making small talk with the stylists before Dominique said, "So, Gia, are there any cute boys at your school?" George blushed and said, "I'm not in school anymore." "Oh, that's right. You just graduated. Do you have any guys you're going out with?" George closed his eyes as he replied, "No." "Well, I don't see why. You're a pretty girl. The boys should notice you more than they do, but sometimes it's all about presentation. I bet when you walk out of here, plenty of guys will be coming on to you. George blushed as he replied in a low voice, "Great, just great." Dominique saw George's reddened cheeks. She knew how much heartache he had given her best customer and decided to keep making him squirm. "What's the matter, Gia? You don't like talking about boys?" "No. It's not my thing." "Not your thing. All girls talk about boys, except those girls who are you know." George smiled briefly and said, "Sure. Come on, I'm just trying to get you out of your shell. You're going into a field where you're going to need to be outgoing. You need to be a little peppier." "I'll make do," George replied. "Okay. Whatever, girlfriend, but you're going to be working with a number of girls, and they're going to talk about cute boys and other girls." "They talk about other girls? Wow, you've really only been hanging out with the boys, huh?" "Mostly," George replied honestly. "Yes, well, we talk about other girls, mostly about how big of a bitch whichever girl we're talking about is," Dominique said as she continued cutting George's hair. "Can't be any bigger of a bitch than you," George thought. After a few more minutes, Dominique finished cutting his hair. George thought his time at the salon was done, but Valentina led him over to a manicurist's station. Dominique sat down and began to paint George's nails the plain maroon color his mother suggested for him. George sighed as his fingernails and toenails were painted in matching colors. Dominique smirked at George's response as he looked at Valentina. Valentina smiled down at George when Dominique finished. Valentina paid for the salon services and tipped Dominique before they walked out of the door. George kept staring at his painted fingertips as he walked towards the car. George sat down in the car and could not take his eyes off them as his mother drove down the road and pulled up in front of a Main Street shop. "What's going on?" George asked as he peered up at his mother. "Oh, I'm taking you inside to get measured." "For what?" "You're a personal shopper. She's going to get you a whole new wardrobe for the girl you're going to be." "I can't have any girl working for me going around looking like that," Valentina said as she pointed to George's clothes. "These are your clothes," George responded. "Yes, but they're just for when I'm in one of my moods." George shook his head as his mother got out of the car and told him to follow her. George walked into the small storefront. A girl in her early 20s came out to greet George and Valentina. She said hello to both of them before she took down George's measurements. George got nervous as the girl approached his groin. The girl smiled up at George and then looked to Valentina and said, "Does Gia know that I know her secret?" "No," Valentina said with a grin. "Well, Gia, don't worry. Your secret's safe with me. You can rest assured that your mom has paid me enough money over the last 3 years to keep my mouth shut for a lifetime." George blushed and nodded before the girl continued, "Now, let's just finish up with these measurements so I can give you the style makeover you so desperately need." George shook his head and said, "You know these are my mother's clothes." The girl turned to Valentina, who nodded and said, "I used to work out in the house with them." "Hopefully you work out in public in something different," the girl responded with a smile. Valentina nodded and the girl added, "Good. I don't want any of my customers going around looking like Gia here. It's not good for business." The girl finished taking George's measurements and asked Valentina what she wanted her to buy for him. Valentina told the girl that George needed work attire and around-the-house clothing as well as some casual clothing to go out in. The girl nodded as she wrote down what George needed before she asked Valentina, "What does she need right away?" "Well, she starts work in a week. So that's a little pressing, but you've got some time. I want to start introducing her to her new life. So if you could, if at all possible, get me some clothes to start her with today. That would be most appreciated." George cringed as he listened to his mother repeatedly refer to him as if he was really a girl. The personal shopper then said, "I'll do my best." George and Valentina then said goodbye to her before they walked back to the car. Valentina drove them home and made a salad for lunch. Valentina put the bowl in front of George, who gave her a confused look. Valentina glared at him and said, "It's your lunch." "Mom, I'm not big into. I don't care what my son George was into, but Gia is going to watch her weight like every other girl. It's part of who you are now. You eat salad. You don't eat junk food. In fact," Valentina said before she stood up and stopped talking. George watched as Valentina took every snack food in the house and threw it in the trash. Valentina then sat down and smiled at George as she said, "There, now, there's no more temptation. I don't have weight problems, Mom. Not now, you don't, and I want to keep it that way. Presentation is a big part of your job, Gia. You need to be in shape. You need to show the customers that doing things right is important." "But I'm just a secretary," George replied before he cringed as he realized what he had said. "That's true, but even the most junior secretary reflects on the company. So what does this mean?" "It means that from now on, you're on my diet. That means a lot more salad, fruit, and a little less meat and a lot less starch and sweets." George ate his salad with a disgusted look on his face. He daydreamed about fishing one of the Twinkies out of the garbage, but he did not want to see what his mother would do if she caught him. He figured that she would find some further requirements to his feminization if she did. After George finished eating, Valentina got up and walked into the living room with George. She placed several magazines down on the coffee table before George. George looked down at the fashion magazines and looked at his mother. Valentina stared down at him and said, "That's your homework this week. You're going to read every magazine there, front to back, and give me a summary of each article." "Are you serious?" "Yes, I am, Gia. This is the perfect exercise for you. You'll learn about fashion and makeup while also practicing for reviewing correspondence. You're going to need to pick out the meat of a letter or email and give it to your bosses." George put his head down and nodded. He hated to admit it to himself, but his mother's explanation actually made sense to him. Valentina then continued, "You need to get into Gia's mind. I've told you this before, but you have to totally immerse yourself in Gia. You have to become her." "I'll try." "Don't try, just do it." George nodded as his mother walked away from the table as he picked up a copy of Glamour and began reading it. He paused to get a piece of paper so he could write down the important points of each article. Midway through the magazine, George heard a stirring above him. He got off the couch and walked up the stairs. He stared down the hallway as his mother was carrying his clothes up to the attic. "What are you doing?" George asked. Valentina smiled and said, "I'm putting George's clothes in storage." "Would you stop talking about me like I'm not here?" George said. Valentina shook her head and put down the box of clothes in her hands. She grabbed George by the wrist and led him into the bathroom and said, "Look in that mirror, Gia." "Do you see George?" "I don't." George shook his head as he felt a strange sense of despair. Valentina nodded before George said, "Do you need any help, Mom?" "Yes, I do, but I need to talk to you about one thing." "What?" "You can't be calling me Mom at work, Gia. I only have one child. Most of my employees know that, so you'll have to call Miss Valenti like all the other girls on my support staff." George gave her a dumbfounded look before he realized that she had a point. Since he did not want to expose who he really was, he knew that he would have to do as his mother said. George walked out of the bathroom with his mother and took hold of one of the boxes she had made up in his room and carried it into the attic. They kept working until all of George's clothing was stored away in the attic. Valentina smiled at George as she looked at his empty dresser and closet and said, "Don't worry, we'll have these filled in no time." "Thanks," George said, striving not to sound sarcastic. George then walked back downstairs and began to read the magazine again until he heard the doorbell ring. Valentina opened the door and let the personal shopper in. She dropped 4 bags off and told Valentina the amount that had been added to her account. Valentina nodded and called out to George as the girl left their house. George came over and saw the 4 bags on the floor. Valentina smiled at her son and said, "Here's the start of your new wardrobe. Grab 2 bags, would you, and follow me." George picked up 2 bags and carried them up the stairs behind his mother. George put the bags down in his room as his mother took a seat on his bed and began going through them. George opened the first bag and saw a bright fuchsia color in the bag. He cringed as he pulled the blouse out of the bag. Valentina turned towards her son as she caught the color of the blouse out of the corner of her eye. "That is a loud blouse," Valentina said with a small laugh as she looked over the long-sleeved, satin blouse with a scoop neckline in her son's hands. George nodded before Valentina added, "I'm sure it'll look pretty on you." "Thanks," George mumbled as Valentina opened the bag in her hands and took out a pencil skirt with a melange of black and white yarns creating a pattern on the skirt. George hung up his blouse before he turned around saw the garment in his mother's hands. "What do you think, sweetie?" Valentina asked. "It looks lovely," George said with a forced smile. Valentina smiled and put it on the bed as she took out the next garment. George peered over at her as she pulled a cobalt blue, long-sleeved top with a cowl neckline out of the bag. "I like this one," Valentina said as she put the top down on the bed while George reached into the bag in his hands and took out a cream-colored, sheer silk blouse with a shirt-tail hem, banded cuffs and a structured collar. George looked at his mother and asked, "How do I wear this?" "You would wear that with a camisole underneath. Did she get me one?" "I don't know. Keep looking." George reached into the bag and pulled out a cream-colored camisole and asked, "Is what you were talking about?" Valentina nodded as she pulled out a black pencil skirt with a metallic lace jacquard with rich silvery luster styles. George grimaced at its attention-drawing design before he took hold of a black, silk miniskirt adorned with tiers of ruffled silk chiffon cut together with a raw-edged and feathery fringe. Valentina smirked at the ultra-feminine skirt in her son's hands and said, "That's definitely for attracting the boys. Let me tell you, in that skirt, you'll be inviting a lot of attention. It's super girly girl." George shuddered as he carried it to the closet, hoping his mother would never make him wear it. Valentina turned away from him and took out a red slimline wool skirt. George turned around and saw the coloring of the skirt and thought to himself, "Couldn't she have gotten me anything that isn't so eye-catching?" George took the skirt from his mother as she threw the empty bags on the floor and picked up the 2 other bags. Valentina removed a gray, drape front, jersey sheath dress with an asymmetrical gathered waist from one of the bags. Valentina smiled and said, "I can't wait to see you wear this to work. A lot of the girls are going to be jealous of this one." George blushed and assumed his mother was telling the truth as he took the dress from her while she removed another dress from the bag. George watched the knit dress with black and white horizontal stripes, a fitted bodice, and a short drop-waist black skirt emerge from the bag. Valentina smiled at George and said, "I want you to change into this one. This isn't around the home casual piece." George carried the dress into the bathroom. George sighed and batted away the tears that began to form in his eyes as he pulled off his shirt. He took off his shoes and removed his sweatpants before he took hold of the dress again. He slipped the dress over his head and felt excited as he sensed the soft feeling surrounding his upper body. He looked at the dress that hugged his slender body and faux curves. George gazed at himself in the bathroom mirror and groaned at the girly girl staring back at him. He lusted after girls that looked like him even as he mocked them with his friends. George was happy that none of them could see what had become of him at that moment. George walked back to his bedroom and saw his mother hanging up a black skirt suit with an A-line skirt in his closet. She smiled at him and said, "Are you ready to see the shoes she got you?" George shrugged and said, "I suppose." "Good. Now, she also got you some underwear. Just some panties, bras and tights, pantyhose and stockings I put away in the dresser and a pair of pajamas I hung up in your closet. You know, that sort of stuff. I put it away for you because they're really quite plain, but the shoes are something you're going to be showing off, so let's gush over them together." George stared at her blankly after glancing at the pink pajama set he saw in the closet as Valentina removed the lid of the first box. George's eyes peered down at the shoes. Valentina reached into the box and picked up one of the shoes to show George. George took the shoe from her and looked over the fuchsia-colored, jelly flats. George shook his head and thought black would be so much better. As George looked over the shoe in his hand, Valentina took the shoes out of the second box. George looked over the glossy patent leather, black, peep-toe pumps with a chunky wrapped 2-inch heel and a large bow at the vamp. Valentina placed the shoes down and opened the last box. George stared at the feathered and jeweled bouquet adorning the peep-toe of the suede, chocolate pump perched with a thin wrapped 4-inch heel and hidden platform. George stared with horror at the last pair of shoes. Valentina read his reaction and said, "Don't worry about the lack of variety. I've already told her to triple your wardrobe and shoe collection by the middle of the week." George stared vacantly at the shoes in silence as he processed his words before his mother put the 3 pairs of shoes in his closet. With the clothing and shoes put away, Valentina decided to get George started in his training. She ordered him to put on the 2-inch heel pair shoes. After his mother left the room, George stared dejectedly at the knit dress he was wearing and the heels his mother had told him to put on. "I can't do this. What the fuck? I can leave. I can," George said before he realized how futile his words were. While he knew he was free to leave, George knew there were no opportunities awaiting him if he walked out his mother's door. He sat down on the bed to put on his shoes. George felt the skirt of his dress's hemline unevenly bunching beneath him. George sighed as he stood up in heels for the first time. George felt off balance and awkward as he walked towards the door. George opened his door and saw his mother at the end of the hallway. Valentina smiled at her son as he walked towards with ungainly steps. He briefly lost his balance and had to press his body against the wall to keep himself upright. George felt embarrassed as he felt the strange comfortableness of the dress. Every step made the soft fabric brush against his legs, which prompted an arousal that surprised and humiliated him. Valentina looked her son over and said, "You look lovely, Gia." "Thanks," George muttered. "No, that won't do at all, little girl. When you're complimented by a lady, you have to take it with a smile and compliment her back." George nodded. "Good, then let's try again. Gia, you look so pretty in that dress." "Thank you, you look nice as well." "That's not really what we're going for, Gia, but it's a start. Rome wasn't built in a day, and you won't become a girly girl in a few hours." George stared at her blankly, trying to shake off her words. "Don't let her get to you," George repeated in his head as he walked behind her down the stairs. George walked gingerly down the steps and breathed a sigh of relief when he reached the base of the steps. Valentina smiled at her son as she began training him. She instructed him on how to walk. George took the small steps she instructed him to take and walked with the slight sway in his hips his mother commanded him to walk with. George felt like a fool as he walked around his mother's home in a dress and heels, following his mother's every command as he walked and stood. An hour into the training, George's feet began to hurt. As his mother went to answer the phone, George took a seat on a couch. He took off his left shoe and began rubbing his feet and ankles. Valentina hung up the phone and went looking for her son. She shook her head as she saw him sitting on the couch and said, "You won't become a girly girl sitting on your ass." "I can't become a girly girl because I'm not a girl. I'm only a girly boy," George protested before he groaned as he realized what he had said. Valentina smirked and said, "If I had raised a girly boy, I'm sure he'd be on his way to college right now and wouldn't need a personal shopper. Try not to think of yourself as what you used to be, Gia. That boy, he's gone. He won't be coming back for a while. You need to be your own woman." George shook his head before he clutched it. His hands pulled off his head, and he saw the painted fingernails that embarrassed him so. Valentina glared at her son and said, "Well, if you want to sit down, then you'll at least do so like a lady. Put that shoe back on and cross your legs." George put the shoe on and crossed his legs over the knees as his mother requested. Valentina smiled at George and said, "Good, a girl always either sits with her legs crossed at her knees or ankles or with her legs together." It's a habit you need to get into if you're going to wear a skirt or heels. We don't want any boys staring up your skirt, now do we? George shuddered at the thought before his mother ordered him to his feet. George began walking with his mother as she instructed him on how to speak. George listened and tried to follow his mother's instructions to speak with a smaller voice. Valentina smiled at her son as he talked and said, "Thankfully, you've already got the speaking with your hands part from my side of the family." George shrugged and continued trying to speak as his mother instructed before they took a break to make dinner. George helped his mother prepare dinner that night for the first time since he was 12. They ate together and then he did the dishes, which his mother informed him was now his new chore. George was unhappy about it, especially since they had a dishwasher, so he considered washing anything besides the pots and pans to be unnecessary. Valentina made George practice his training for a few more hours before she told him that he could get ready for bed. George felt relieved by the fact that he would be able to take off his heels. Valentina smiled as she saw him take them off and carry them up the stairs. "Be sure to put on that pajama set," Valentina shouted up the stairs. George nodded to himself and walked into his room to change into the pajamas his mother wanted him to wear. George disrobed and hung his dress up and placed his shoes in his closet before he took out the pajamas. He placed on the pink, lightweight fleece, lounge pants patterned with white hearts and tied with a satin drawstring at the waist before he placed on the pink and white stripped Henley knit top with deep V-neck. George stared at the extremely girly pajamas he was wearing in the mirror for a moment before he went downstairs to see his mother. Valentina smiled at George and said, "That's a great outfit. It fits you so well too." George blushed at her compliments and said, "Thank you. That's a lovely pair of boots you have on." "Oh, these? I've had them for years. I love them, and I'm sure you've seen them before, but you never said anything about them." "Must have slipped my mind," George muttered. Valentina grinned at her son and said, "Well, I think it's time for you to go to bed." George wanted to yell at his mother for telling him to go to be like a child, but he was happy to get away from her watchful eyes. George walked up the steps and went back into his room. He turned on his computer and began to search for pornography as he did each night before bed. His mind then wandered and he muttered, "Who the hell is George Michael?" George's mother's admission that he was named after an entertainer stuck with him. He wondered if the singer was an old crooner and did a Google search for the entertainer's name. George clicked on a link and looked over some of the singer's hits. George saw a title that seemed familiar. "Wake Me Up Before You Go Go," George said as he saw the title under a link referencing a musical act called Wham! "He did the song from Family Guy," George said as he clicked the link. The video started and George's jaw dropped as he saw the high-voiced, dancing man he was named after. "What a queer!" George said as he crossed his pink pajama-covered legs. George then stared down at the white hearts of the pajama pants he was wearing inside. He gazed at the computer screen for a moment before he shut it down and went to bed. George spent the rest of the week following his mother's instructions. When she was not home, Valentina left her son written instructions and required him to provide proof of his compliance. George felt like a prisoner as he did each item on her list. He had no control over his day-to-day activities, which made him feel despondent at times. George was restricted to eating oatmeal for breakfast and took pictures of himself dressed in his pajamas and eating it every morning as his mother required. George would then get dressed in the outfit his mother instructed him to wear and begin doing his chores. George's regular cleaning of the house was checked each evening by his mother. She made sure there was never a dirty cup in the sink or dust on a tabletop. Valentina also monitored her son's progress walking in heels. He was required to wear them all day, and she checked how he walked to make sure he was doing as he was instructed. George skipped wearing heels the first day she went to work and his mother scolded him as she realized that he had made no progress in getting more comfortable in the shoes. From then on, George was required to wear 3-inch heeled shoes or higher, which he was not ready for. George stumbled around the home and had to show marked improvement each day. George knew if he did not, his mother could find a way to make his life much worse. For lunch each day, George was restricted to eating a salad. He was again required to photograph himself eating to prove that he was complying with his mother's orders. The restrictive diet Valentina put George on prompted him to lose 5 pounds in the week, dropping him from 140 pounds to 135. Valentina shook her head when her son complained about it and told him that she wished she could lose 5 pounds so easily in a week. After lunch, George was required to check in with his mother regarding his progress that day. George got on his computer and did a video Skype with Valencia so she could listen to him talk in his high, small voice and make sure that he was wearing his required makeup and clothing. After their video conference ended, George was required to go into the living room to read and summarize the articles in the fashion and women's magazines that his mother subscribed to and got for him. Valentina reviewed each summary when she came home and discussed them with George regarding what takeaway pointers he should have taken from the articles. George would start preparing dinner in the evening and would cook it with his mother once she got home. As he did the dishes after each dinner, his mother would go to his room to inspect it to ensure that he had not brought any of his male clothing down from the attic. Once she was sure there was no masculine contraband in George's room, Valentina retired to the couch and made George watch her television shows with her. George used that time to think of excuses for turning down his friends' invitations to go out with them. Given his fingernails and thin arched eyebrows, George knew that he could not go out with them. His expressed reasons for not hanging out with them became more difficult for his friends to believe as the week went on. His training also affected his conversations as many of his friends noted that something was wrong with his voice as George spoke in a smaller voice and with more inflection as his mother required, even though he made sure to not use the higher tone his mother required him to speak with. In addition to trying to successfully driving George and his friends apart, Valentina also tried to separate George from his old life in other ways. In addition to changing his diet, wardrobe and appearance, Valentina decided that he needed a clean break from his legal identity. After work on Thursday, Valentina came home with the papers to legally change George's name to Gia. George looked over the papers with trepidation. He saw the name he had always written, George Shrimpton, and looked over the name his mother had given him, Gia Gigliotti. His father's last name had been swapped by his mother for his maternal great-grandmother's, with whom Valentina had a strong relationship. George asked why he had to change his name. Valentina explained, "Many of my employees know I've got a son named George Shrimpton. We can't have any giveaways. Can't we just change my first name and pass off my last name as a coincidence?" "No, it will lead to too many inquiries, Gia," Valentina responded. George saw her stern look and knew he had no choice but to sign the document. He placed his pen to the paper and handed it back to his mother. George was upset about changing his name, but he figured he did not have much choice in the matter and that it could all be rectified in the end. The Sunday before his first day of work came, and George felt sick to his stomach regarding his feminization. He did not believe that he could pull off what his mother expected of him. Valentina shook her head at her son and decided to show him that he had nothing to worry about. Valentina made George dress in the striped dress and his fuchsia jelly flats. George felt uneasy as his mother ordered him out the door. They walked to the car and George headed out for his day en femme since he had gone to the salon. Valentina drove him to a mall 2 hours away from their home to minimize the likelihood that anyone George knew would see him. As George walked beside his mother with his pocketbook on his shoulder, he noticed that he was not receiving probing or scornful looks. He was largely ignored except for a few women staring at his outfit and the occasional guy giving him brief lustful stares. While the looks assured him that he could convince others that he was a woman and not just a boy in a skirt, the lusty stares of the men made him sick to his stomach as he realized that he might have to deal with men hitting on him. George woke up the next morning and tried not to think about what the day would bring. He pushed himself out of bed and turned off his alarm. George opened his bedroom door and went down the stairs to grab a quick breakfast before he went into the bathroom. He stepped into the shower and made sure his body was free of hair before he toweled off and did his makeup. After finishing applying his lip gloss, George walked into his bedroom to get dressed. He opened his closet doors and took out the outfit his mother instructed him to wear. George placed the black skirt suit on his bed before he went to his underwear drawer. George took a pair of black panties from his drawer as well as a matching black bra. George dropped his towel and put his underwear on before he secured his breast forms in the cups of his bra. After adjusting the straps of his bra, George walked back to his closet and took out a cream-colored blouse. George placed the blouse on and buttoned it while he walked back to the bed. George tucked his member, but he felt worried about securing it. He walked back over to his dresser and took out another pair of black panties and drew them up his legs. George then tucked himself once more before he strolled towards his bed. George then stepped into his skirt before he pulled up the rear zipper. He slipped on the jacket of the skirt suit while he walked towards his closet. George then took hold of a pair of black 3-inch heel pumps and a pair of black ballet flats. He placed the heels on his dresser and then placed his feet into the flats. George then put his heels into his pocketbook before he walked down the stairs. Valentina smiled up at her son as he came to the top of the stairs while she grabbed her keys and headed for the door. She waited for him to reach the base of the steps. As he reached the bottom step, Valentina grinned and asked, "Are you ready?" "I guess I'm as ready as I'll ever be." "Well, I'm glad to hear it." George nodded before Valentina kissed him on the cheek and added, "I'll see you there." George nodded and put his head down as he grabbed his keys as Valentina stepped out the door. George looked around before he opened the door and headed to his blue Mustang. George felt as if the eyes of the neighborhood were upon despite no one being outside. He started the car and pulled away from the curb. As he drove down the streets, George felt a gnawing feeling in his stomach. He got onto the highway and daydreamed about speeding off down the road and driving past his exit. He wanted the freedom to do as he wanted, but he knew he lacked the money to do so. The open road offered him only an escape to nowhere. As the exit neared, George thought about leaving and never coming back once more. However, fears about his lack of money and feminized appearance made the thought subside in his mind. George pulled the car onto the exit ramp and continued down the road. He felt scared as he pulled up in front of his mother's office building. After taking a few deep breaths, George swung his legs together out of the car as his mother had taught him. He crossed his legs and swapped his flats for his heels before he stepped out of the car. George walked towards the door trying to give a vacant stare as he walked into the office building. He walked through the lobby without anyone noticing him. George got onto the elevator with a group of strangers and hit the elevator button for his mother's floor. No one he was on the elevator with gave George more than a passing look, which filled him with a sense of ease about his appearance even as what awaited him in the office filled him with dread. The elevator doors opened for his mother's floor, and George stepped off and headed for her office door. George walked through the doors and saw a familiar face standing in the waiting area. "You must be Gia," Amanda said as she reached out her hand. George shook Amanda's hand. Amanda Bossy was the company's vice president and one of only 2 employees of his mother's he had met. Amanda and Dorian Williams, the company's chief financial officer, were frequent guests of his mother's at their home. George knew from the wink that Amanda gave him that she was well aware who he really was. George was not bothered by the fact. He knew there would be no way of hiding who he was from Amanda and Dorian, but he hoped that no one else knew the truth. Amanda walked him through the office and introduced George to various employees until he met Tara, the office manager. Tara shook his hand and introduced him to every girl he was going to be working with. Tara explained George's responsibilities to him before he was seated next to Rebecca, the company's other junior secretary. Rebecca shook George's hand and told him about what she was going to teach him. George listened as she told him how to use the phone system, the access codes for the copier and how to operate the fax and postal machines. George followed her instructions and felt that he would be able to do the job without much trouble. George was relieved as he listened to Rebecca. He realized that she did not know he was really a guy, or if she did, she was not letting on to it. George sat at his desk and waited to answer calls when Rebecca was unable to. As Rebecca talked on the phone with a client, the phone rang. He answered the call with the company's customary greeting. "Thank you for calling Valenti Enterprises, this is Gia. How may I help you?" The client told George who he wanted to speak with. George searched the phone directory for the extension and transferred the client. Shortly after George hung up, Tara called his phone. George listened to her directions. George went to a saleswoman's office and asked what she needed copied. The woman gave George a stack of papers and told him to make 3 copies of each. George nodded and carried the papers to the copier. He put the stack in and watched the copier work as it made a mindless hum. George tried not to think about the pain he was feeling in the heels of his feet. He was used to the daily onset of pain that started with his heels and spread to the balls of his feet and then to his ankles and calves. While Valentina assured him that he would get used to it in time, George hoped that his time in heels would be short enough that he would not have to. When the last copy was made, George collected the papers and sorted them as the saleswoman requested. George carried the bundles back to her and placed them on one of the saleswoman's guest chairs and exited her office. George then walked towards his desk and sat back down. He was relieved to get off his feet for a minute. The phone rang again shortly thereafter. George picked it up since Rebecca had excused herself to go to the bathroom. George called the salesman the client was seeking and told him who was calling. The salesman told George to take a message. Tara walked over to Rebecca and started talking to her while George took down the client's message. As he hung up, Tara asked, "Gia, can you be dear and get me a cup of coffee?" George glanced up at her to question her, but he realized that she was serious. He took the cup from her hand and carried it into the kitchen. George saw a basket containing K-cups and put one into the coffee machine. George thought to himself, "I can't believe my mother has me making another secretary coffee." As the cup brewed, George called out to Tara, "How do you want it?" "Creamer, no sugar," she replied. George nodded as he turned back around and picked up the cup. He put the creamer in the coffee and carried it to Tara. Tara smiled and thanked him before she took a sip and said, "Oh, yum. You put just the right amount in. Good going, girl. I think I'm going to have make that exclusively you job." George blushed before Tara added, "I'm just teasing, girl." Tara then said, "We order in from Luigi's every Monday. Can you take everybody's orders down, Gia, and call in the order?" George nodded and got to his feet with a pen and a pad of paper. George walked from office to office taking down everybody's order. He hesitated before entering Dorian's office and asking her. Dorian smirked at George as she looked him over and said, "You look like a fine young lady, Gia. I'm sure you'll do great here." George nodded before he asked for her order. He took it down and breathed a sigh of relief before he entered Amanda's office and took her order down. George walked to his mother's office last. He knocked on her closed door and his mother said, "Come in." George slowly opened the door and walked towards her and told her he was taking down orders. Valentina nodded and said, "Well, I'll take the large Greek salad." "Oh, by the way, so will you." "I wanted the—" George began to reply before he saw his mother glaring at him. George nodded and put down 2 Greek salads before his mother asked, "How are you liking it here?" George glared at her for a second before he thought better of complaining and responded, "Everyone here is so nice. It's not that bad." "I knew you'd see that once you got here," Valentina replied before George nodded and walked out of her office. George walked back to his desk and phoned in the order to Luigi's. After he was done, he started talking with Rebecca between their handling of phone calls. After 30 minutes, he saw that Tara was calling him. George picked up the phone, and she asked him to come see her. George got to his aching feet and strolled down to see her. Tara told George to make copies of a stack of documents given to her by one of the salesmen. George nodded and made the copies. He then carried them to the salesman's office. He smiled and thanked George as he put the papers down and walked out of his office. George then walked back towards the front desk and heard Rebecca flirting with a man as she signed for a package. George glanced at the guy and saw him wink at Rebecca before he turned towards the door. Who was that? The UPS guy. You couldn't tell by the brown uniform. Do you think people go around looking like that by choice? George laughed as he took a seat next to her and said, I guess not, but how do you know each other? He comes in all the time. Do you guys date? Oh, no. He's married. Then what was with the flirting? I was just being nice, Rebecca replied. He called you pretty. And I appreciated that. I might be dating someone, but that doesn't mean I'm dead to all other guys. Besides, it's just harmless flirting. It helps keep a smile on people's faces. If it works for you, well, flirting is a big part of the job. I'm sure you'll do it. I don't really care much for flirting with guys. Well, you better get over that in a hurry, Rebecca replied. Why? There are a lot of guys who come in here for deliveries. You know, there's the mailman, the FedEx guy, the UPS guy, the delivery supply guys, and all the food delivery boys that come in around lunchtime. So? I don't need to flirt with them. You do if you want good service. Guys react to stimulus. If you're an ice queen, they're not going to go out of their way to help you. A little flirting gets the supply guys to put the heavy stuff in the supply closet for you. You just bat your eyelashes, smile knowingly, and tell him how big and strong they are. That's not really me. You have to have a good rapport with them. We'll have to get you some practice. The nice guy is all yours. I don't want to do. You're going to have to get over it sometime. Oh, wait. What? Here comes the delivery guy from Luigi's. I can't do this. Sure you can. We paid on the company credit card. All you've got to do is write his tip on the receipt. Just remember, polite, smile, girls out, play with your hair a little, and above all make him feel important, Rebecca said as she got to her feet and pushed George's chair under the receptionist window. Hello, Mississippi. I've got a delivery. Oh, let's see what we've got here, George said as he stood up and pushed his chest out, prompting the man to leer at his bust. Oh, it all smells so good, George said with a smile as he ran his fingers through his hair. I'm sure it is. Let me just write your tip in. There we are. Thank you, miss. Oh, you are so welcome. Oh, wait. Yes. Could you be a dear and carry into the conference room? I just had my nails done and... It wouldn't be any trouble, Mississippi. Oh, thank you, George squealed as he leaned towards the smiling man. George opened the door and led the man towards the conference room. The delivery boy's eyes never left George's rear as Rebecca smiled while she watched the delivery boy's eyes from her seat. The delivery boy set the food down on the table and walked out as George said, "Thank you so much. I didn't know if I could lift that heavy box." It wasn't anything I couldn't handle, the delivery boy responded. Thank you so much again, George responded as he took a seat as the man headed for the door. As the delivery boy walked out of the office, Rebecca turned to George and said, "Oh, you slut." George blushed before Rebecca slapped his arm and said, "I'm just playing with you, girl. You are too cute." "Oh, thanks, like I'm not embarrassed enough," George said as he stared down at the calendar on his desk. "What are you embarrassed about? You used what God gave you and made the best out of it. It's like you never showed a little leg to get a guy to do something for you." "Well, Oh, you're not one of those feminist, I can do anything, and I don't need a man for nothing types." "I've never been called a feminist," George replied with a smile. "I like to think of myself as a feminist, but I'm the type of girl that when she sees a boy panting like a dog for me, I'm willing to let him make my life a little easier." George smiled at the idea of getting men to do what he wanted instead of being on the receiving end of a girl's exploitation of his attraction. George shuddered as he realized what he was thinking. "What's wrong?" Rebecca asked. "Nothing, I just got a little chill," George lied. "Oh, well. We're heading into the conference in a minute anyway. Just let me set up the system so we can pick the phone up in there." George nodded and waited for Rebecca to be done before he escorted her to the conference room. Before they sat down, Rebecca called each girl to tell them the food was ready. George walked into the conference room with Rebecca and took a seat beside her, and they chatted as they began to eat while the other girls filed into the room. George smiled as he chatted with the girls. He traded compliments about clothing and hair with them and complimented some of their jewelry. As the conversation shifted from personal appearance to cute guys in the office building, George fell silent. He smiled as the girls talked about a number of men in the building that he did not know. The girls then changed the topic to start talking about the men in their lives. George listened to the girls' list of complaints about what their husbands and boyfriends would not do. George nodded along to the girls' complaints until someone asked him about his boyfriend. George froze for a second before he admitted, "I don't have a boyfriend." "Why not?" Tara asked. George blushed and shrugged before he said, "It's just not high on my list of important things." Rebecca shook her head and said, "I've got a cousin that would probably go for you." "That's all right. I don't like being fixed up," George replied. "Oh, you like to be pursued," Claire, his mother's secretary, said. George shrugged before Claire continued, "She's just old-fashioned. That's the way it was when I was her age. The guys came to you. You didn't need to be fixed up. They came after you like men and tried to win you over. It's not that way anymore," Rebecca said, prompting Tara to add, "I don't know when guys got so lazy." Claire answered, "It was right around the women's rights movement. So many girls got uppity and uptight about being hit on or asked out that guys simply didn't know how to approach a girl. They didn't know because their reactions were so wildly different." "Uppity?" Tara asked with a laugh. They thought they were better than everyone, guys, women who didn't subscribe to their point of view. They confused a whole generation of men, and they confused their kids. Tara laughed off Claire's words as they continued to eat. After they finished eating, George got back to work. He faxed documents and copied others for the salespeople before Claire called him and asked him to file away some documents for his mother. George walked over to Claire's desk. He picked up the documents on her desk as Valentina looked on. Valentina asked her son, "Do you know where those documents go?" "Yes, Miss Valenti," George replied to his mother. George took the documents to the file cabinet and placed them where Claire instructed before he walked back to his desk. George continued fielding phone calls for the rest of the day and talked with Rebecca whenever they both had a free moment. As the workday came to an end and the company's employees started filing out the door, George walked to his mother's office and knocked on the door. Valentina let him in, and George took a seat and asked, "What's the next step up for me?" "The next step?" "Yes. Aren't you getting a little ahead of yourself? It's your first day, and you're already talking about moving up." "I just need to know." "Well, the next step would be becoming a senior secretary. It's what Laura and Claudia do. You work with everybody beneath me and Amanda, and you have more difficult tasks like writing correspondence. What about from there? After that, you could either be promoted to office manager or an executive secretary, if you haven't gotten a 4-year degree by then." "Well, how long does it usually take to get there?" "From the bottom, 6 to 10 years depending on the girl, but you're not just competing against the girls here. You're competing against graduates and experienced outsiders." George's stomach sank as he heard his mother's words. He realized what he had only suspected before: he was going to be spending years in skirts and heels.